Hi everyone! For my literature review, I chose to explore blended learning and whether or not it can be implemented successfully in a middle school classroom. So first of all, what is blended learning? According to the research, blended learning is a combination of traditional face-to-face teaching methods with online teaching methods. Within such an environment, students have some control over the time, space, and pace of their own learning. Technology can be used to enhance learning through things like video lectures, blogs, and online chats. Technology can also be used to supplement learning within the classroom with things like interactive websites and online games. The really nice thing about blended learning is it can be a great way to differentiate instruction and meet the needs of individual learners. So the question is, can blended learning work in a middle school classroom? Much of the research, unfortunately, is on post-secondary education. However, there is research that shows that blended learning instruction can produce higher academic achievement in middle school students, but there's a lot of things you must think about and consider if one wants to implement a blended learning environment within their classroom. So some of the support for blended learning, Christopher Longo wrote an article that discusses the benefits of using blended learning with inquiry-based instruction. He says blended learning meets the needs of multiple learners by using traditional classroom instruction while incorporating online methods. He says it's a way to deliver instruction in multiple formats to engage students and address their individual learning styles. He feels that blended learning provides for flexibility, as students can work on online components anytime and any place. And he also speaks about multiple modes of delivery. He talks about guided inquiry, where the teacher does the facilitation and the students solve the problems. He speaks about flipping lessons, or the flipped classroom, where students preview the content before coming to the classroom. And he talks about online inquiry, where platforms such as Moodle and Google Drive are used to supplement learning and build technology skills. Another support for blended learning was a study done on math performance. This was a study of 53 sixth grade students in a middle school in southwest Turkey. The authors studied one unit of a technology software course that was taught to sixth graders, and it was instructed with either blended learning methods or the current teaching methods of the teachers. The study consisted of a pre-test, post-test design, and the results were based on an academic achievement test and a product evaluation scale. So the results showed that students in the blended learning group scored higher on the academic achievement test. They showed that students in the blended learning group scored better on their completed software products. And the results also showed that in the control group, girls are more successful than the boys, but in the blended group, there was no significant difference between the genders. Yet another support was also on middle school math again. This study consisted of 413 sixth grade students, and the groups were assigned based on the teacher's current methods of instruction. So one group was made up of students whose teachers taught primarily with face-to-face instruction with the same pace and path of all instruction for all students. And the second group was made up of teachers who used station rotation model of blended instruction almost every day. The results of this study showed that blended learning instruction was the best for individual student growth, where face-to-face instruction was the best for students to meet curricular outcomes. This is evidence that blended learning is a great method for differentiation and meeting individual student needs. One thing to note about this study is there is a limitation because 91% of the population of the schools qualified for free or reduced lunch. So this just means the findings cannot be generalized outside of this demographic. Another study on math supported blended learning as well. This study consisted of 335 students with disabilities along with their special education teachers, and all the students received their math instruction in the resource room. So groups were randomly assigned to the blended learning group or the control group, which they called the business as usual group, BAI. And learner objectives were the same in both groups. So in the blended learning groups, there was computer-based interactive lessons, videos, and hands-on applied projects. The teachers were provided with the lesson plans, and the teachers also attended a 2-day summer workshop on how to implement this model. In the business as usual groups, the teachers just continued with the regular programming. So the results showed that students in the blended learning group scored higher on academic achievement than those in the control group. And the authors explained this by indicating that the blended learning groups had hands-on problem solving, and they also said there was a reduced cognitive load by adding story context, visual representations, and multimedia applications. And the final explanation was that the business as usual teachers moved on more quickly from one topic to the others. Another study on blended learning at middle school was on motivation and engagement. This also was positive for the effects of blended learning. This was on 107 7th grade students in 4 middle schools where the classes were randomly assigned to the blended learning group or the control group. Within the blended learning group, students had netbooks and Wi-Fi access at school. There was information technology labs available for those students who didn't have internet access at home. Moodle was used as a platform, and both students and teachers received training. And the face-to-face and online activities were determined by the researchers. So the results of this study showed that the blended learning group scored higher on an academic achievement post-test. It showed the development of student engagement was more effective within the blended learning group, and the development of active collaboration and learning was more effective within a blended learning group. However, studies do show that blended learning does not always work. So a study by Pace and Mellard was done with 2 blended learning schools and 1 traditional school, and the ELA school scores of 6th grade students were compared. The blended learning groups in this study employed what they called the Blended English Language Arts, or BELLA program, and this was a program that was commercially available, and it was supplemental curricular materials for ELA. The results of this study were not what the authors expected. The achievement scores of all groups declined throughout the study, so the validity must be questioned. The problem with this study is there was an inconsistent implementation of the BELLA program between the 2 control groups. One of the groups had 70 students in the lab at one time and spent 350 minutes per week in the lab. The other group had 35 students in the lab at one time and spent 100 minutes per week in the lab. Other problems were the student monitoring of the lab was insufficient simply due to the sheer numbers of students in the lab at one time. Students did not have headphones to listen to the course content, so therefore that would not provide for a very conducive learning environment for all of those involved. The teachers had limited BELLA training. There were 3 days provided, but not all teachers attended all days. And there was a question of test fatigue because the students had just written a large state assessment prior to the assessment of this study, so they wondered if that affected the results of their study. So some things to think about and consider if one wants to implement a blended learning environment. The teacher training and support and blended learning models and online softwares and programs, they must be adequate and sufficient. For success in a situation such as this, teachers need to know what they're doing. There must be student access to technology at home and at school. We know as teachers we often have limited technology to implement our regular classroom days, let alone a blended learning environment. Students must have knowledge of and be familiar with the model along with the technology used. We can't just throw it at them. We have to teach them how to respond to the model and how to use the technology. And student needs are very important. Which model will work best for certain students, which activities work best. We need to ensure we are hitting the needs of our individual learners when using a blended learning environment. So the research does show that blended learning can be very successful when implemented properly within a classroom, but there are considerations for future research. So things we should think about are how do we ensure there is adequate training for teachers to ensure they implement a program such as this successfully? And what are the best methods of training to provide to the teachers? How do we ensure that students have adequate exposure to and are familiar with the technologies being used in a blended learning environment? What do we do if students do not have access outside of the school? We know this is a huge problem in rural areas especially, and we have to make sure we account for this. Big part, what are the needs of the individual learners? And what resources and supports are available for both students and teachers? We can't just do this without training and support and people to help us, and neither can our students. So blended learning can be very successful in a middle school classroom. We just have to ensure that we do the research and we have the support to implement it successfully. Thanks for listening.